October 6th, I'm Yumna Naufal. These are today's headlines. Hezbollah loses 8 of its fighters while dozens of Jabhat al-Nusra militants are killed in clashes along the Syrian border. Relatives of the captive soldiers and policemen further escalate their protests, blocking several important roads in the country. And on the Syrian-Turkish border, the Islamic State assault on Kobani continues, with Kurdish defenders fighting back another IS attempt. 8 Hezbollah fighters and dozens of jihadists from Jabhat al-Nusra have been killed in fighting along Lebanon's border with Syria. Hezbollah confirmed the deaths and said it will hold funerals for 2 of the killed fighters in Lebwe in the Bekaa Valley later tonight. At least 20 other fighters from the Lebanese party were wounded in the clashes when fighting broke out late on yesterday and outside the village of Britel, where Hezbollah fighters repelled attacks by Jabhat al-Nusra on the party's 2 main posts, Ain al-Sa'a and Mihafara, briefly taking over the post before it was eventually regained by Hezbollah. And so relatives of the soldiers and policemen held hostage by Syrian militants have escalated their protests even further, blocking completely the Dahr al-Baydar highway in addition to briefly blocking the parallel road of Zahle, Tahrish and the Kalamoun highway. In the second week of disrupting traffic between Mount Lebanon and the Bekaa, the protesters blocked the roads with sand mounds and burning tires. All roads have been reopened. The families are protesting what they perceive as inaction by the government to solve the hostage crisis, which has lasted since early August. Leading Hezbollah deputy Nawaf Moussawi has said the government must take Iran's offer of military aid seriously. Speaking at the Jafarit High School in Sur, the MP urged Prime Minister Tamam Salam and his cabinet to seriously consider an offer from Iran, arguing that the arms offered to the Lebanese military from Iran is meant to confront Takfiri attacks. But he drew a parallel to the Kurdish leader Masoud Barzani, who has stated he might seek Iranian help to fight the IS attack on Kobani in Syria. Lebanese Forces Chief Samir Jaja says the government should force Hezbollah to withdraw from Syria as a response to the recent attacks by militants on Lebanese border towns. He called for an expansion of the UN interim force in Lebanon's mandate so the peacekeeping troop can also cover the border between Lebanon and Syria. The proposal, he said, has been a long-standing demand of the March 14 bloc. Accusing the government of running away from the issue of Hezbollah's presence in Syria, Jaja said their continued involvement in the war will bring the Shias of Lebanon more crises and tragedies. Kurdish fighters in Syria have fought off another assault by the Islamic State, with 1 female defender carrying out a suicide attack on the Islamist group. The town of Ain al-Arab, known as Kurdish Kobani, has been under siege by the jihadist militants since mid-September. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, militants from ISIS attempted to storm the town but were fought back by the Kurdish People's Protection Units. Fighting in the Kurdish majority region on the Syrian-Turkish border has forced around 160,000 to flee their homes and cross the border into Turkey. Australia has conducted its first armed flights over Iraq as part of the US-led coalition against the Islamic State group. The Australian crews boarded their planes in the United Arab Emirates and flew to northern Iraq, but did not fire any weapons. Prime Minister Tony Abbott declared that Australian Special Forces troops will be deployed in Iraq to assist in the fight against ISIS, while its aircraft joins the US-led airstrikes. While the involvement of Australian aircraft has been expected, the use of Australian troops on the ground in Iraq was not widely anticipated. Abbott said the cabinet has authorized the deployment of Australian Special Forces in order to advise and assist the Iraqi forces. And the parents of the U.S. aid worker held hostage by ISIS militants released photographs of their son and parts of a letter he wrote to them from captivity, in which he says he's scared to die but at peace with his belief. Peter Kasig, who is 26-year-old, was taken captive a year ago while doing humanitarian work in Syria. He was threatened in an Islamic State video issued on Friday that showed the beheading of another British aid worker. And Paula Kasig of Indianapolis said for his release, they are appealing for people to use the name he has taken since converting to Islam, Abdurrahman Kasig. Pentagon records show he spent a year in the Army as a Ranger and was deployed to Iraq from April to July 2007. After leaving the Army, he became an emergency medical technician and traveled to Lebanon in May of 2012. volunteering in hospitals and treating Palestinian refugees and those fleeing from Syria's civil war. Coming up next, a Norwegian couple wins the 2014 Nobel Prize for Medicine or Physiology. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching the 4:20 o'clock news on Future TV. The United Arab Emirates says U.S. Vice President Joe Biden has apologized to the Abu Dhabi Crown Prince for any implications and remarks he made last week that the UAE had supported fighters in Syria. The phone call, confirmed by U.S. officials, came after a day Biden offered a similar apology to Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Biden's comments in an address to Harvard University students were the strongest yet from a senior U.S. official on Turkey's alleged support for ISIS groups in Syria's 3-year civil war. Erdogan has repeatedly called for the Assad government, however, to be ousted.
So now we have a coalition, but it's still going to be a hell of a long fight. A hell of a long fight, but it cannot be, even if we wanted to, it cannot be our fight alone. This cannot be turned into a U.S. ground war against another Arab nation in the Middle East. The idea of identifying a moderate middle has been a chase America has been engaged in for a long time. We Americans think in every country in transition there's a Thomas Jefferson hiding behind some rock or a James Madison beyond one sand dune. The fact of the matter is the ability to identify a moderate middle in Syria there was no moderate middle. But my constant cry was that our biggest problem is our allies. Our allies in the region were our largest problem in Syria. The Turks were great friends, and I have a great relationship with Erdogan, which I just spent a lot of time with. The Saudis, the Emiratis, etc. What were they doing? They were so determined to take down Assad and essentially have a proxy Sunni-Shia war. What did they do? They poured hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of tons of weapons into anyone who would fight against Assad, except that the people who were being supplied were al-Nusra and al-Qaeda and the extremist elements of jihadis coming from other parts of the world. Now you think I'm exaggerating? Take a look. Where did all of this go? So now what's happening? All of a sudden, everybody's awakened because this outfit called ISIL, which was al-Qaeda in Iraq, which when they were essentially thrown out of Iraq, found open space and territory in eastern Syria, worked with al-Nusra, who we declared a terrorist group early on, and we could not convince our colleagues to stop supplying them. So what happened? Now all of a sudden, I don't want to be too facetious, but they have seen the Lord. Now we have, the President's been able to put together a coalition of our Sunni neighbors, because America can't once again go in to a Muslim nation and be the aggressor. It has to be led by Sunnis to go and attack a Sunni organization. And so what do we have for the first time? Now Saudi Arabia has stopped the funding going in. Saudi Arabia is allowing training on its soil of American forces under Title X open training. The Qataris have cut off their support for the most extreme elements of the terrorist organizations. And the Turks, President Erdogan told me, he's an old friend, said, you were right, we let too many people through. Now they're trying to seal their border.
Somali troops and African Union forces have taken the town of Barawe, a major stronghold of al-Shabaab, back 2 days after the forces captured Adeli, another key town held by the militants. The port city was a key factor in financing the al-Qaeda-linked armed group, which reportedly charged taxes to ships that sailed or docked at Barawe's port in order to raise revenues to expand its military campaign. The African Union says al-Shabaab has been using the town, which the al-Qaeda-linked fighters had held for 6 years, as a base to launch attacks on Somalia's capital, Mogadishu. The al-Shabaab commander Mohammed Abu Abdullah has previously vowed that his group would maintain pressure on Somali and AU forces even if they took Badawi. Sweden's ambassador to Israel, Carl Magnus Nasser, has been summoned to a meeting with the Israeli Foreign Ministry a day after Sweden recognized the sovereignty of Palestine and after Israel's Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman said the Swedish Prime Minister Stefan Löfven was rushing to a decision without understanding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Ambassador Carl Magnus Nasser was called in by the ministry's Deputy Director General for Europe, Aviv Sharon, who protested and expressed Israel's disappointment at the announcement. The newly elected Swedish government broke away from EU reluctancy on Palestinian sovereignty, becoming the first long-term EU member to recognize a Palestinian state. 7 other EU states have already recognized the Palestinian state, including Bulgaria, Cyprus, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Malta, Poland, and Romania. Brazil's leftist incumbent Dilma Rousseff has come at the top of the presidential elections but has not gained enough votes to avoid a runoff and will face Aécio Neves, her pro-business rival. With all votes counted on Monday, Rousseff led with 41.5% support compared with 33.6% for Neves. He surged sharply in the pre-election period after intense campaigning with an emphasis on safe change. His record as a popular 2-term governor seems to convince enough opposition voters that he was the surest bet to try to unseat Rousseff, who has presided over a long economic slump but remains popular among the poor. Mina Silva, a prominent environmentalist who has received lead opinion polls but saw her support collapse late in the campaign, was in 3rd place with just 21% of the votes. The American-British scientist John O'Keefe and the Norwegian couple May-Britt and Edward Moser have won the 2014 Nobel Prize for Medicine or Physiology for discoveries of cells that constitute a positioning system in the brain. In a statement when awarding the prize at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden's capital of Stockholm, the Nobel Assembly said the discoveries have solved a problem that has occupied philosophers and scientists for centuries. Medicine is the first of the Nobel Prizes to be awarded each year, in addition to awards for outstanding achievements in literature, physics, chemistry, economics, and the famous Peace Prize. This marks the end of our bulletin for today. Now for a reminder of our top stories. Hezbollah loses 8 of its fighters while dozens of Jabhat al-Nusra militants are killed in clashes along the Syrian border. The relatives of the captive soldiers and policemen further escalate their protests, blocking several roads in the country. And on the Syrian-Turkish border, the Islamic State assault on Kobani continues, with Kurdish defenders fighting back another attempt to storm the town. Those are your Monday headlines live on FutureTV. Happy Adha to all our viewers. Have a good one.